welcome everyone to another exciting installment of our series on the return to Zion on Shivat Zion. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is we're going to be looking at kind of the violent situation during certain periods of the Persian period. We're going to be looking at some texts, we've looked at it already, but we're kind of looking at it more on the background of what it was like, in fact, when things were not going well, right? When we were under threat. Obviously, I am thinking kind of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, right? Memorial Day and Independence Day, as we kind of look at another time when we came back to Zion and we also had to kind of fight and defend ourselves from the surrounding nations. So I wanted to look specifically at verses that talk a little bit about that. So again, what we're looking at tonight is we're going to be looking at kind of the more hostile side of the Persian period. It wasn't all puppies and roses. And we've gotten hints of that, but I wanted to now do it in kind of a concentrated way and look at these texts in a concentrated way so we can have a kind of a picture of what the challenges were. Okay, so I just want to remind you as a background, we talked about how when the returnees, right, when the Judeans actually did try to build the temple during the reign of Darius, it actually went surprisingly simply. Not when they first came under Cyrus, but when they were determined to build under Darius. We see this account where I'm going to kind of skip over this. What happens is Tatnai, who is the governor of the whole area, comes and says, "Hey, who gave you permission to build this?" And they said, "Oh no, we absolutely got permission. We got permission from Cyrus. This is something that we're supposed to build under Cyrus." And so he writes to King Darius and he gives them the whole account, and the account, the way it's given to us, is actually pretty neutral. It's not saying how dare these people build this thing. It's much more Yediah laheve lemalka diazalna lihud midinta leveta la rabba v'hu mitbnei even kalal v'an amitzam bechutlaya v'avilta dach asparna mitavdag umatzlach biyedhom. In other words, we went to the state, the province of Judea, to the house of the great God, right? It's being built of hewn stone, of wood, of inlaid wood, and the work is being done well. It's going well, okay? And he says, and then we asked them, "Hey, who gave you the orders to build this?" And they said, and we got their names, right? We did everything we were supposed to do. And they said, Anachna himo avdohi diya Allah shmaya. I'm reading again. I'm reading from Ezra 5. Okay. Anachna himo avdohi diala shmaya shmaya va'ara, excuse me, uvanayin baita dihava b'nei mikadmat dinashnin sagian umelch Yisrael rav b'nai v'shachlele. They give a history. They say, "Hey, we're the servants of the God of heaven and earth. We're rebuilding the house that was built many years ago by a great king of Israel." And they explain that we angered God. We were handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, and so that temple was destroyed. We were exiled, but King Cyrus issued an order to rebuild it, right? And he even released the vessels that had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, and then we came and we laid the foundations, but it wasn't finished, right? And now he quotes these people, and meanwhile he allowed the governor of the entire area allowed them to continue building while he's checking with Darius, and he says that Darius now could may it be good for your majesty. Just check and see if in fact Cyrus gave an order in order to build this house of God in Jerusalem. And may the king send what he wishes to do to us. And the king, in fact, says they search the archives. He says, "Yup, found it, and you're going and here's money and help to finish it." So everything there goes very, very smoothly with the temple under Darius. However, and I've talked about this more than once, the danger is less in building the temple and more in building the walls of Jerusalem. And there were attempts to build the walls in Jerusalem. We can see those attempts because there's a letter that we see in the same area in Ezra Dalet and Ezra 4. I'm moving backwards. Why? Because when it's saying, why did we not build the temple, right? Why didn't we build a temple? And the answer is because surrounding nations wrote letters and stopped us. But if you read the letter is not about building the temple, and the letter is not from the same period. The letter is from much later, okay? It says, first there's passages that we don't have a letter for. We don't know enough detail here. It says, "Uvemalchut Achashverosh b'tchilat malchuto katvu sitna al yoshvei Yehuda v'Yerushalayim." In the reign of Ahasuerus, right? At the beginning of his reign, these people who we did not include in building the temple, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem. Do we know what this letter says? We don't know what the letter says. Okay. We also know that it's long after they rebuilt the temple under Darius, because Ahasuerus rules much later. Whatever Xerxes we're talking about, it's later. Okay. And then we say Ubime Artaxerxes Katav, and now we have a whole bunch. Now we have the actual letter that's brought for us. And now we can kind of see that things weren't all wonderful for the Jews, the Judeans under Persian rule, because there was an issue. The Judeans wanted to build Jerusalem. Okay, they wanted to rebuild the city. They wanted to rebuild. And the surrounding nations and surrounding, or people who, it's not even call them surrounding, they're right there. There are other nations that are very close to Judea. They don't want this to happen. And they write to King Artaxerxes and they say, I'm going to skip all these different names. Okay. Talking about all the different people who were part of this. Okay. So they write to King Artaxerxes, Avdach Enash Avar Nahar Uchen, Avar Enash Avar Nahar, the people of beyond the river. In other words, people of this entire area were all writing to you, Your Majesty. Okay. Yidia lehevi lemalka, dehudaya disliku min levatach alena atoli Yerushalayim, kiryata marata uvishta banayin, v'shuraya shachlilu v'ushaya achitu. The Jews who came up from you to us, they have come to Jerusalem and they're rebuilding that rebellious, horrible city. They are finishing the walls. They are repairing the foundations. What does this mean? They're saying there's a little bit of a blame here. They weren't here. These guys weren't here. They came from you to us. You sent them. You guys have been, and we see when Ezra comes with more exiles who are returning. So in other words, there is a flow of people at different points from Babylon to Judea and Jerusalem, and say, these Jews who came from you to us, now they're going up to Jerusalem and they're rebuilding that city, and it's a rebellious city. Ka'an yidia lehevi lemalka, dihen kiryatadach titpenei, v'shuraya shachlelun, minda v'lo v'halach la yintinun, v'aftom malchim tahanzik. What's going to happen if they rebuild this city and they finish the walls? They're not going to pay any taxes. And in the end, it's going to harm your kingdom. Ka'an kol kavel, now of course this is a letter in Aramaic, right? Ka'an kol kavel di malach hechle malachna v'arvat malka la arich lana lemechazeh al dina shlachna vodana lemalka. We are employees of the palace. We eat the salt of the palace. In other words, we get a salary, literally a salary, right, from the palace. And so we don't want to see the king hurt in this way. We've written to advise the king. We're not tattletales. We are your employees. We worry about your benefit. Divakar b'svar dochranaya dihavahatach udashkach b'svar dochranaya v'tinda dikiryata dachikira marada umahanzikat malchin umedinan veshtadur avdin bagava min yomat alma al dina kiryata dach hacharvat. They say, You go and search in Sefer HaZikaron in your records, right? Of the records of your forefathers, of your ancestors, and you'll find there that this city is in fact is known as a rebellious city, and it harms kings and it harms states, and it regularly has rebellious people from ancient days, from olden days, not olden days, forever. That's why this city was destroyed, because it's a rebellious city. Right? We're telling you that if you allow the city to be completed, you're no longer going to have control over this entire area. This city, if it's rebuilt, is going to be the downfall of your control over this entire area, because they're so rebellious, and then they'll have a capital. And he sends back, in fact, he said, you wrote to me, it was read to me, and I am now saying that, in fact, I checked and it's true. In other words, I did it. So I in fact had a search in the records, and I found out forever these guys have rebelled against kings. They've risen up against kings, and they have regularly rebelled. And there were powerful kings over Jerusalem that managed to kind of bring them into control, and they exercised control over the whole area of Avra Nahara beyond the river, and then they had taxes. So ka'an simu te'en levatala guvraya yilech b'kiryata dachlatit b'nei ad mini ta'ama yitzam. Right? Now I'm telling you, issue an order, stop them. Okay? Stop them from building unless you get another order from me. Don't turn away. Don't let them sneak away and do this, because there, in fact, is going to be damage to the kingdom from this. And what they did is they actually stopped them by force. Be'edra v'chayil, right? They stopped them by like edra is zroa, right? With a forceful arm. And in our context, it's saying, oh, so they stopped building the temple. But we know from the letter that it's not talking about the temple. It's talking about Jerusalem, and it's talking about a much later date under Artaxerxes. Okay? So we can actually appreciate when Nehemiah goes in front of Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes says, and I'm skipping to Nehemiah Bet, right? Nehemiah 2. Nehemiah Bet, that when he says when the king says, why do you look ill? Right? It must be enzekim roa lev, right? It must be a evil of heart. In other words, you're thinking bad thoughts against me. And he says, no, may you the king live forever. But he says, madua lo yer'u panai asher ha'ir beit kivrot avotai chareva u'sha'ara u'klu va'esh. How can my face look good? How can I not look sad for the city where my forefathers are buried is in ruins, and its gates have been consumed by fire. And then when the king says, what do you want? And I say, it says, Ve'etpalel el Elohei Hashemayim. I prayed to God before I asked my question, because we already know Artaxerxes doesn't want this, right? V'omar lamelch im hamelch tov v'im yitav avdecha lefanecha asher tishlacheni el Yudah el ir kivrot avotai ve'evnena. Okay? If it pleases the king, may you send me to Judea, to the city where my forefathers are buried, and I will build it, right? And the king, in fact, allows it. Now, which Artaxerxes, we don't know, right? Like, there's several Artaxerxes. Could that letter that we read before have been an earlier Artaxerxes? This is a later Artaxerxes? Perhaps. Or remember that Artaxerxes said, you can't build until you get another order from me. Okay? But what we see is that there's a lot of negative feelings towards the Judeans as a political entity, right? Because the Judeans are allowed to build their temple. That is not an issue. The issue is, if they're building the city, you guys are rebellious people. No, you're not allowed to stop them by force. He doesn't say stop them by force. He says stop them. And they go and they stop them by force. And here, Nehemiah is going to have to rebuild by force. That's the context that we have of the rebuilding. So that when we come in later, what made me think of this also was what we read last week when we were looking at Nehemiah Tet, Nehemiah 9, which, like I said, does not fit the rest of the book. It seems to be brought in from elsewhere. The whole philosophy of it doesn't match the rest of the book. We don't know when it's from exactly, but it has this idea of hine anachnu avadim aleh. We are slaves on this land. Why? Because we have kings who rule over al gviotenu moshlim ubeamtenu kirtzonam ubetzara gdola anachnu. These kings rule over our bodies, right, and our animals as they wish, and we are in great distress. It could have been a time in the Persian period where the Persian kings were like, yeah, they're rebellious people, and we've got to come down on them hard, right? So this is not, the whole Persian period was not necessarily one of just peace and wonder, but what we see with Nehemiah is despite what this kind of atmosphere, he's going to do what needs to be done. He's going to take his life in his hands and say to Artaxerxes, I must please let me go back and build the city. And even once he gets permission, that's not the end, because he's going to be rebuilding during a battle. There's no, in the political rebuilding of Judea in the Persian period, there's no peaceful rebuilding. There is rebuilding with a sword on your hip, as we're going to read. And I just want to frame it this way. Now, I do want to take a little bit of a skip. Let's take a look at Ezra, just to give you an idea also, because we're going to be reading in Nehemiah, is this idea that, okay, the king gave him permission. So why are there other people who feel themselves free to do all sorts of things to stop this by force? And the answer is, well, in the ancient world, you could rule something that didn't necessarily mean you had total control over everything going on in every place. So, for example, Ezra. In Ezra 8, Ezra is returning to Judea with numerous people with him, with a lot of gold and valuables for the temple. And he has permission from the king, not just permission from the king. The king has appointed him. The king has given him a job. Okay, so he is a royal appointee with proof. Vekrasham Tsom, they're by the city of Babylon, right? So Nahar Ahava, we don't know what river Ahava is, but one assumes it's a tributary of the Euphrates that's near the city of Babylon, because they're leaving Babylon, and it says, and before they head out, Vekrasham Tsom al Nahar Ahava, להתענות לפני אלוהינו, לבקש ממנו דרך ישרה לנו ולטפנו ולכל רכושנו. I proclaimed a fast there on the banks of the river Ahava to, I think afflict ourselves was the only way to translate, to afflict ourselves before God, and to ask for him a straight and a straight path, right? A smooth journey for us and for our children. Our children, they here are probably including also our wives and all of our property. Why does he have to ask? Why does he have to do a fast and a prayer? Kivoshti lish'o min hamelech chayil ufarashim le'ezreinu me'oyev badarech. Ki amarnu lamelech lemor yad Eloheinu al kol mevakshav letovav uzo v'apo al kol ozvav. And because Ezra says, I was embarrassed to ask the king for an escort, for a military escort to protect us. Because we said to the king, our God protects our God protects everyone who are his people, everyone who are his seekers. God protects for good, and his anger is against everyone who leaves him. So I was worried that if I said, well, we're going to be going in a dangerous way, could you give us a cavalry? Could you give us an escort, a military escort? The king would say, what do you mean? I guess your God isn't that powerful then. So I didn't ask for an escort, and instead we fasted and we prayed. Vanatsuma vanivaksha melohenu alzot ve'yater lanu. So we fasted and we prayed and we asked God for this, and God granted it to us. In other words, we arrived safely. So that was something special from God. But the point is that even if you are a royal appointee going on royal business through the land, that doesn't mean you're safe. And this is almost miraculous that everything is fine. I see that there is a question or comment in chat. See? Libby says, do we know anything about the real motivations of the surrounding people when they tried to stop the rebuilding of Jerusalem? What they claim as their motivation isn't exactly convincing. Okay, their clear motivation, they really do see this as a political power. What I would say is they really see this as a political power move from the Jews. And like, in other words, the Judeans, if they rebuild their capital, who's going to rule over this area? The Judeans, right? So they don't want the Judeans building their capital. Now, the Judeans aren't really thinking in terms of ruling over the area. They're thinking in terms of rebuilding Jerusalem. But it is very clear, it very clearly has a tremendous symbolic significance to the people of Judea. More than, like, as much as we talk about Jerusalem, we always connect it to the temple in our minds. Beyond the temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem is tremendously powerful and meaningful. And I think for the people of Judea, building the Jerusalem means we have a state. Obviously, I'm not talking like a modern state. They're thinking in terms, but essentially, if we rebuild Jerusalem, we are back. We have kind of an autonomous area that we can consider ours. And for that reason, other nations don't want that built, right? They don't want that built because as long as Jerusalem's not built, so it's a bunch of people just all living together and kind of, and someone else can say, no, really, this is our province. But once you have Jerusalem built and it is the Judean Jewish city, that says something. And I think that is really what it comes down to. It really has a lot of meaning to both sides. And we can see how much meaning it has for the side of the Judeans just in terms of how much they risk and how much they're willing to do to get it built, despite the fact that they're building it in the middle of essentially what's almost a war we're about to turn into a war. So let's take a look. All right, here I'm going to start with actually a later chapter, Nehemiah Vav, Nehemiah 6. And this is Nehemiah himself, what the kind of he's dealing with personal threats and has to be on his toes because people want to assassinate him. He is personally in danger. Vayhi kasher nishma l'Sanballat v'Tovia u'legeshem haravi u'leyeter oivenu ki vaniti et hachoma v'lo notar ba'paretz gam ad tahit latod lo amadi b'sharim. He says, we had built the walls and there weren't any more breaches, but the gateways, the doors were not in. So it wasn't completely finished. Vaishlach Sanballat, and these are people from essentially different ethnic groups. Vaishlach Sanballat, v'Geshem elai lemor. So Sanballat and Geshem sent to me saying, Lechavani v'ada yachad b'kfirim devikat ono v'hem choshim lasot lira'ah. So they said, let's have a meeting in Kfirim in the Ono Valley, and they mean to do me harm. Do me harm probably means to assassinate me. Like, then I know just to beat him up. What would that do, right? He said, no, I can't come down because I'm super busy. I'm in the middle of a big project, so I just can't take a break. They sent to me 4 times, and that's what I answered. And then he sent an open letter so everyone on the way could read it, right? Anyone who saw this letter could read it. It wasn't sealed. Ketuvba, have you ever seen a clay letter that's sealed? It's actually sealed with clay. So you literally cannot read it until you break the clay off. So this is possibly what he's talking about. Not clear. But this is an open letter. So anyone can read it. It said, Bagoyim nishma וגשמו אומר, אתה והיהודים חושבים למרוד על כן אתה בונה החומה, ואתה הובל להם למלך כדברים האלה. He says, they said, what did they say? We say, they say, we have heard, and we've heard in among the nations, right? And Geshem, here written Gashmu, right? Geshem, has also says, you and the Jews are planning to rebel. That's why you're building the wall. And you will be their king. That's what we've heard. Okay? So, וגם נביאים העמדת לקרוא לך בירושלים לאמור, מלך ביהודה, ואתה ישמע למלך כדברים האלה, ואתה לך ונביאתך יחדיו. They're like, so, and you've even set up prophets, and we've talked about how prophets this time, hey, you could have bought them, right? You set up prophets to call over you in Jerusalem. Now there is a king in Judah. And these things are going to reach the king now. Now, come and meet with us. In other words, we're threatening you that we are going to send this news to the king if you don't come and meet with us. In other words, and this is very dangerous because the idea is the king hears that he's going to be executed. And that's how they're going to get him. So meet with us. It's blackmail, right? ושלחה אליו לאמור, לא נהיה כדברים האלה אשר אתה אומר, כי מלבך אתה בודם. Okay? He said, no, you made this up. Ki chulam mir'im otanu lemor. They try a different tack. What's amazing is that Nehemiah has a tremendous amount of confidence. He's like, no, you made it up. He doesn't say, and the king won't believe you, but it sounds like he thinks that that's enough. You made this up. There's no proof. And so you're not going to get me in trouble with the king on this. Ki chulam mir'im otanu lemor, yirpu yedehem min hamalacha v'lo te'aseh. Okay? Everyone, they were all trying to make us scared, saying, oh, their hands will weaken from the work. In other words, they're going to stop this work, and it won't be done. And he says, now strengthen my hands. I'm going to get this done. And then he gives that report of the person who is a prophet, some kind of prophet or claims to be a prophet, who says, come and hide in the temple precinct. And he says, no, absolutely not. And he's like, he's like, you were hired by Tobiah and Sanballat. This is another way that they're trying to get me to, not to stop, but here to kind of discredit me by having me hide in the temple. And we don't know, is this what he thinks, or was he actually hired by them? But he's, the prophet who speaks to him says it's because his life is in danger. That's why he should hide in the temple. And he's like, no, they're just trying to get me to do a scandalous thing. Okay? And there are other prophets that are hired after him. He says, and he's like, God, remember this for their detriment. And also, and add to this all these different prophets who were trying to scare me off. And what's interesting is we don't know, were those prophets bought by them, or did the prophets think that Nehemiah was going to get himself killed? And he said, God, stop it. You're going to get yourself killed. Right? But he didn't listen to them. But in fact, now let's go back a step. Because they had multiple pronged attacks. There was the stuff against Nehemiah, and then there was the stuff against the people and the actual building enterprise. And this is what I mean when I say, when they were building, there was no building Jerusalem without it being a situation of constant conflict, or probably not at the beginning so much, because they were doing other things to try and stop it. But as it got close, as we saw, what we just read was a little bit later. It's all done except for the gates, and that's when they get really nervous and they really want to just essentially assassinate Nehemiah. They're saying, "Forget it. We've got to stop this." And this is also closer to the end. Note that it's different groups, different political / ethnic groups who don't want Jerusalem to be built. You've got Sanballat and Tobiah. You got the Shomronim, the Samaritans, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites. They're the Philistines, right? They heard ki alta arucha lechamot Yerushalayim, that the walls of the city were being healed. Ki hechelu haprutzim lisatem veichar lehem maod. the breach parts are starting to be filled. Later on, the assassination attempts were when they were already filled. Vayikar lehem ma'od, they became very angry. Vayiksheru chulam yachdav lavo lihilachem b'Yerushalayim v'lasot lo to'ah. So they all had made a conspiracy together to come and fight over Jerusalem and to throw it into confusion. Vanitpalel el Eloheinu v'na'amid mishmar alehem yomam v'layla mipnehem. So we prayed to God and we set up a watch day and night from them. We knew that they were going to attack. And so this is the classic dual thing that you do. Pray to God, but don't just pray to God. You also arm yourself and set up a watch, right? So he did both. Vayomer Yehuda, right? And Judah was saying, Kashal kol hasabal, it's kind of a poem. Kashal kol hasabal, va'afar harbe, va'nachru lo nuchal livnot b'choma. The strength of the burden carrier, here it says basket carrier, has failed. There's too much dirt. There's too much dirt to carry, and we will not be able to build the wall. It's too much for us. It's just too much. Vayomu tzarenu lo yed'u v'lo yir'u ad asher navo el tocham v'haragnum v'shbatnu et hamelacha. And at the same time that they're feeling exhausted, our enemies were saying they won't know and they won't see and will already reach among them and kill them and will stop the work. Vayhi kasher ba'u haYehudim hayoshivim etzlam vayomu lanu 10 pamim mikol mekomot teshuvu aleinu. So Jews who were among them came and they said 10 times, but all the time they would say from all the places that they were returning from, and they would report on their planning to attack. They're planning to stop the work. Va'amid mitachtiot lemakom ma'acharei lachoma batzchichim. Va'amid et ha'am l'mishpachot im charvotehem, ramchehem, v'kashtotehem. So what did I do? At the lower level, behind the walls, I stationed people with their families armed, with swords, with spears, with bows and arrows. Ve'erev v'akum v'omar el hachorim v'laskanim v'yeter ha'am al tir'u mipneihem. So this, once again, so he arms everyone. He sets up a watch, he arms everyone, and then he has to give them strength because they're saying, our strength is gone. And that's when the enemy wants to attack. And they're hearing again and again, the enemy's going to attack us. They're planning to attack us. He says, Va'erev v'akum v'omar ha'chorim v'askanim v'yeter ha'am al tir'u mipneihem et Adonai hagadol v'hanora zchoru v'hilachamu al achechem b'nechem uvnotechem nishechem uvatechem. So I got up and I said to the nobles and to the rest of the nation, do not fear them. Remember our awesome, great God. And the truth is, sovereign is right here because it's not the name. It's not Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei. It's not the name of God. It's actually Adonai, my master. In other words, our sovereign God. And fight for your brethren and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. Why? They've got their families next to them, right? He's stationing them with their families so they know what they're fighting for. He's arming them next to their families. You are fighting under our God. You're fighting for your families and your homes. Vayhi kasher sham'u oivenu ki noda lanu vayafer Elohim et hatzatam v'nashav kulanu el hachoma ish el melachto. So the enemies discovered that we knew about their plan because God had frustrated it, and we could return to the wall to our work, but not completely. They still had to. Couldn't forget that this plan had failed, but you don't know what other plans there are. Vayhi min hayom hahu chatzi narai osim b'mlacha v'chatziyam machzikim v'arimachim v'maginim v'akshatot v'shiryonim v'asarim achrei kol beit Yehuda. So from that day on, half of my servants, my entourage, would work, and half of them would be armed with spears and shields and bows and armor, and with the officers standing behind all of the people of Judah to protect them. Habonim b'choma Even the people who were building, who were working, they would have a basket and with their burden in one hand and doing the work with one hand and a weapon in the other. And the people who were building, they're using both their hands, right? So the one who's carrying something, he could have a drawn weapon, but people who are building are using both their hands. So they had a sword girded at their side, and I had someone to blow the shofar next to me. ואומר אל החורים ולעסקנים ואל יתר העם, המלאכה הרבה רחבה, ואנחנו נפרדים על החומה, רחוקים איש מאחיו. במקום אשר תשמעו את קול השופר, שמה תקבצו אלינו, Eloheinu yilachem lanu. What's the story? So you're all spread out along the wall. Not everyone, people aren't ready to go to battle. If you hear me blowing the shofar, I want everyone gathering to me. And God will fight for us. God will fight for us. Everyone's armed. Everyone's got their weapons. But we will fight and God will fight for us. ואנחנו עושים במלאכה וחציים מחזיקים ברמחים מעלות השחר עד צאת הכוכבים. So we worked and half would hold spears from dawn to night, right? So in other words, the entire working day, they were armed. And even during the night, they stood guard. Even during the night, גם בעת ההיא אמרתי לעם, איש ונערו ילינו בתוך ירושלים, והיו לנו הלילה משמר והיום מלאכה. I said to them, each people come to Jerusalem with a servant so that you can switch off and have someone standing guard at night. ואין אני ואחי ונערי ואנשי המשמר אשר אחריי, אין אנחנו פושטים בגדינו, איש שלחו המים. So we never took off our clothes because we always had to be ready to go into battle. And that's the way the wall was built. So I know that we've looked at different passages of these before, but I couldn't help but bring it today as we go into Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, Memorial Day and Independence Day, this idea of building with the readiness for constant war, the combination of we need to prepare and God will fight for us, right? We're armed and God will fight for us. We have to always hear what the enemy is planning and be ready, and we cannot stop building, right? We will build despite the fact that we're all under threat. We will continue building while safeguarding ourselves and while preparing for battle. And I think that history repeats itself, and I can't help but connect it to the state of Israel today and this idea that we build under constant threat and even the feeling of it's too much, we're tired, how can we do this? And then it's like, well, but we have to, right? Fight for your homes, fight for your families, and God will fight for us. So on that note, thank you for joining me. So have a meaningful Yom HaZikaron and a happy Yom HaAtzmaut, and I will see you next week.